But Connie and Ernie were actually very, very gentle people, and they didn't have what you would call a living faith, but there was something going on.
Yes.
And I know Christine had a Bible, and she used to now and again say, you know, can we go to church? And the only thing I enjoyed about going to church, I have to admit, was you could actually sing really, really badly. And if you've heard me sing, you'd know how bad that is. That's why I became a disc jockey. But it was that kind of, you could sing and nobody told you off.
Right.
Where if you did it in the street, you'd probably get locked up, you know. So it's that kind of,
Yeah.
So I knew there was something going on, but she never pushed it. Whether it was I was too bossy or whatever, I don't know. But she never pushed it.
Mm-hmm.
Then in about 1985 was a kind of a real big time for me, because it was just before then that I'd gotten offered my first head gardener's job. And I have to say it was a 56-acre estate, and bearing in mind I'd not been to horticultural college or any of that stuff, it was one of those times, you know, where you apply for something, and then after you've applied you think, why did I do that? You know, this is really crazy. And to find myself with the job was really amazing, because it was a huge step for someone like myself. And that we went there in the June or July. I started the job, and that autumn we had the hurricane, which blew half the estate down, so it was a real test. But it was at that time when we decided we wanted to have children, because she had a career, we found that she couldn't because of some abdominal problem. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And that developed?
That developed. It was, I think we both knew it when it was diagnosed, that was the end, as it were. Mm-hmm. And we made a pact together that we wouldn't talk about death. We'd only talk about positive things, which I think we maintained. And she fought on and off for 5 years through several kind of sessions of chemotherapy. Lost a hair, gained it, lost a hair, gained it, that kind of thing. And tragically died in the autumn of '89. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And what did that do to you?
Here's a good job there wasn't live TV. I have to say, I was incredibly angry.
At God?
Yeah, my question was, if there is a God, and she knew him, and I couldn't have cared less about him, and yet she'd suffered for 5 years, and I wasn't, well, I was suffering as an looking on, and going through all of that, and I'm not belittling that, but this God, and all I understood about God was he was someone who he's someone who loves you. God is love, I was told. And so why should she go through this pain and suffering for 5 years and then ultimately lose her life? I was incredibly angry, and I remember she died at about 4 o'clock on a morning, and straight after the body had been taken away from the home, because I brought her from the hospital because she wanted to die at home. Right. And I just thank God now that I had that opportunity of spending that last 2 weeks of her life. But I remember that morning being out in the garden and just screaming and being incredibly angry that, God, if you're there, I really don't know what you're about. This is just obscene. Yeah, extremely angry, extremely angry.
I guess that, obviously we'll move on from that in a minute, but I guess going through that helps you, especially if you meet people in your evangelistic work that have had similar, it helps you understand them, doesn't it? You know what they are going through.
It's an incredible release, you know, when you're talking to somebody on the door. And you know, I had it when I was shortly bereaved, you know, that people come up and say, I understand, but you know full well they don't. Unless they've been in that place, you don't. And it's about empathy. And I know through my door-to-door work, I've had many, many occasions where people have said, you know, if you've been where I've been. And I think in all things, you know, we have to be careful when we're sharing with people that as they try to tell you their troubles, you pile yours upon them. So I'm very cautious with that. But you know, when you can tell when they're at that place where they want to know, and you just say, well, actually, this happened, and suddenly, all the walls come down, and you're in that place. It's very, very important.
And therefore, in one sense, anything that we've been through, and we can look back over our lives, and maybe we're still, even as Christians, asking the question, why God? And maybe we'll never know until we see everything from his perspective in eternity. But all those things that we say, why God, to, can actually be a very positive thing as we reach out to people that are also saying, why God?
I think it's about remembering where you came from that's allowed me, and I think that's why God allowed me to go through that time. You know, there were several opportunities I had to come into that place, but I just, you know, I've got it sussed, and I'm in control. And I think that's how we live our lives. And so I think sometimes we try to do too much. We think that we are the people. I have the answer, and you're flipping well going to hear it. You know what I'm saying?
Whether you want it
Where
or not,
actually it's about, you know, now I understand. It's about God's Spirit.
So the death of your wife probably made things worse rather than better.
Oh, for sure.
And put an extra brick wall between you and God than had been there up until then.
I would, but I suppose the best way to explain it would be, actually it was a bit like a bomb going off.
Okay.
And so all the bits were still there, the wall was still there, but it was all over the place. And so it allowed me then to start to kind of try and piece this stuff together. And one of the great testimonies I have through this story is the fact that our doctor, a lady called Jane Woodgate, was a lovely lady. I didn't know she was a Christian, but she was very, very gentle, and she was there for Christine when she was poorly. She was there to certify the death. And bless Jane, I do bless you, even if you're watching this program, that she didn't give up on me. She tried everything to get me counselling, etc., etc. And she just said, recently, she said, I realised that with John Goodway, the only thing I could ever do was to pray. She said, because he didn't want to listen, he wasn't going to hear anything I had to say. And the great testimony of that is years later, I went to the High Sheriff's breakfast in Lewis, and which was a Christian gathering. And Jane saw me walk in, and she just went, what happened? What happened? And tears were in her eyes.
I can believe it.
And she said, I can honestly say that from that time to this time, I prayed for you every day, because I knew that God had got his hand on you, even though you couldn't see it.
That's brilliant.
And I find myself now in her surgery, in that same chair, time it was updated, in that same chair, sharing with this woman, praying with this lady, where years before I could have throttled her because she was a doctor and she should have cured my wife. So that's been an incredible testimony. And she's actually, Jane is part of my prayer support.
That's great. So how did you come to the... I've asked that question 5 times already. We're getting there. I mean, how did all of this come through, and that you really came through to this God whom you were angry with, whom you didn't believe could do what people told you he could do, and all the rest of this garbage that had been built up in you over the years? How did all that get dealt with and you come to who you are today?
Strangely enough, I suppose it would be only right and proper to say that I had a visit from the Jehovah's Witnesses. And I was at a very low ebb, let me hasten to add. But the second visit I invited them in, and they were telling me about heaven, and they were telling me about this lion eating straw, and that we'd have this kind of small hold-in, and everything would be idyllic. Well, coming from a Dorset background where we used to pull water from the well, and when it was wet and when it was snowing and all of that, this wasn't painting a very rosy picture. And the very idea of a lion eating straw was kind of just way too beyond anything I was ever going to get my head round. And so I have to admit, I gave them short shrift.